I'm dreaming of silence. Hoping your memory just might fade. I wait a minute for the sun to rise. Yeah, she got the best of me this time. The nights alone have got me petrified.
Hello everyone and a warm welcome to this session this afternoon. My name is Siwan and I'm the head of the Scaling Award at the Fair Education Alliance, and I'll be supporting the session this afternoon alongside Cheyenne, who is the head of the Innovation Award at the Fair Education Alliance. Huge welcome to this session this afternoon on financial management. Really delighted to have two brilliant speakers with us this afternoon. So we have Robert Craig, who is CEO of Skillsbuilder Partnership, and Daniel Keller, who is CEO of Unifrog. So we're really delighted to have you with us at the Impact Festival taking place until tomorrow. Please do tweet about the event using hashtag Impact Festival and tagging us at _the FEA. Now, different to other sessions where we've done the networking activity at this point, we're going to do things a little bit differently for this session, and without further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to Robert and Daniel to kick us off this afternoon. So over to you both.
Amazing. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. It was very exciting music as well, to have that kind of introduction. And apologies up front if anyone came to this session last year, because as you'll see from my unchanged front slide, it's very similar to the session last year. So I thought we'd kick off with just a very brief introduction. So my name's Robert, and on this picture I'm the sort of corporate dweeb looking one. Daniel's the cool guy on the left. My background is I started off as a strategy consultant and worked in impact investment, and a qualified accountant with a legal background as well. So the sort of finance side of stuff is something I like to talk about a lot. And obviously what we're going to be doing today is just I guess a taster of everything. Not going to be going into massive amount of detail. Over to you, Daniel.
Cheers, Robert. Yeah. Hey everyone, my name's Dan, so I'm the CEO at Unifrog. I joined Unifrog when it was quite a small organization, about 5 of us on the team 6 years ago, and I sort of feel a lot of what we're going to cover today is to some extent things that I've picked up along my journey with Unifrog. We're getting on towards 50 members of staff, and I started on working on the sort of sales and partnership side, and then picked up a lot of other areas really as Unifrog grew. So I think a lot of examples and stuff I'll be giving as well will be things that I've sort of learned and picked up along the way, and how we do things at Unifrog. And if anyone has any questions at all as we go as well in terms of how we do certain things and stuff, then really happy to help with that.
Great, thank you. So we're going to be covering broadly three or four different areas. The first is revenue models. So that's what are the different ways of making your money. The second is unit economics. So that's like the mechanics of it. How does it all add up? And this is really important. It's very easy to get lost on the product and thinking how we're going to do it and then how we're going to sell it. But actually, does it all add up when you put it together? And Daniel's going to talk a bit about budgeting then as well, which is putting to, as I'm sure many of you know, budgeting bit is the bit which usually gets most airtime. But how do you actually do that? What are the different ways of doing it? And finally, we're just going to touch on what I call FinOps to make it sound cooler, but it's just financial operations, and just thinking very briefly about how you can make this really effective. So as Dan said, chip in along the way. There's rest points as we go to ask questions. I appreciate some of it is a little bit dense. And so what we're trying to do here is you're not going to walk away from this being an expert in financial modeling or anything like that, unless you started like that, in which case hopefully you won't get worse by the end. It's very much to leave you with an idea of these are things that exist. Here's a rough idea of what it is. And if you're interested, if you think it's something that's useful, take a note, go away and Google it would be my advice. But if there's anything along the way that you want some clarification on or more examples, then just let us know and we can kind of build stuff around what we've discussed. So I thought we'd kick off with a little bit of interaction. So what you're going to need to do here, hopefully after a year or more than a year of lockdown, you all know how to use annotate, which would be that little pen bit on your screen. Use a little stamp, draw something if you want. As to where you are on this scale of terrified to I got this. So if you want to just put a little stamp there, how confident are you when it comes to your finances? Cool. So we've got some sort of a good bit of bunching in the middle, slightly towards terrified. We've got one person who's feeling much more confident. A couple of people feeling a lot more confident. So that's really good. That helps give us a bit of an idea of where we are as a group. And then let's. Oh, can I wipe those annotations? It's clear. There we go. So the next one to annotate is how big is your organization? Just so we get a feel of who's in the group. If you, again, anyone who's just joined, we're just annotating here. Put a stamp next to it, put a squiggle next to it. You less than 500K? Is your organization's revenue more than 5 mil? So it looks like we're getting lots more people around the slightly smaller side of things, which is probably what we'd expect, because if you were running a £50 million charity and you hadn't cleared how to do your finances, there might be some concern. Excellent, cool. So it looks like as a group, we're mainly from small, probably kind of starting out organizations. And we've got a bit of a mix of confidence, but for the most part, people a little bit unsure about finance, which is great because that's exactly what this session is all about. So now we're going to break out into groups. And the key here is just to spend 5 minutes, say hello to other people in the group, and also discuss what you'd like to get out of this session. Then what we'd like you to do is, if one person volunteers to take a note, could you quickly then be ready to play those back to everyone when we come back into the room? So we're going to be put into breakouts right about now, I think.
I'm putting 5-minute breakout rooms.
Great.
Yeah. Cool.
again, everyone. I don't know how many other groups, but some got cut off midway. It's always the way. As we join back in. So would anyone like to volunteer to share what they and their group wanted to get out of this session? Any volunteers? Come off mute.
I'm happy to dive in.
Oh, thanks, Emma.
If you like. So we were in breakout room 3. It was myself and 2 colleagues, in fact, from an organisation called 2 to 3 Degrees. We were brutally cut off before we fully got a chance to tell each other what we did. So, but we did talk about what we wanted to get out of the session. So it was partly that we wanted to kind of understand your take on best practice, you know, and whether there were particular kind of tips and tricks that you'd learn about how to make finance, you know, work in a charity setting optimally. Part of that was understanding what questions we ought to be asking ourselves about our financial strategies and the way that we organise finance in our organisation. So how do we kind of interrogate our own practice and answer, you know what questions to ask. And then some of us were particularly interested in growth models. And you know, the kinds of assumptions that you should build into a growth model as you try and plan out your charity's kind of financial future. That might be getting a bit kind of technical and detailed for today, but that's where we got to.
Yeah, some really good questions there. And I think the sort of tips and stuff was something we touched on. I think hopefully we can give some of those. I think, as you say, maybe the assumptions pieces is a little bit too detailed, growth assumptions, because I think a lot of the time it's really so dependent on your own context, isn't it? And breaking those assumptions down. Did anyone else, one more person from a different group, want to share back their discussion?
Hi, Robert. I was joined by Alison and Mary, and I think on top of what Emma has just said, there was one question around whether, you know, we're tending to use Excel or the equivalent counterparts for managing and keeping track of finances. So whether there are other whether there's other software and also maybe different financial planning tools that are useful for small organizations, including charities. And the second point that came up was maybe some information on the requirements that small organizations, statutory requirements that small organizations need to be aware of, either charities or not charities. That would also be useful, I think. Thank you.
Yeah. I think on the second one, I don't think we're going to be able to touch on that today. But there's definitely a whole piece on charity governance and financial requirements and reporting. On the systems, hopefully we can touch on that at the end, though, and just mention some of the different systems that are out there. Great. Okay. Well, hopefully you had a nice little opportunity to say hello to each other, even if some of us got cut off mid-sentence. And it seems like hopefully at least half of or a third of what you're trying to get out of this session, we might be able to answer. So moving on, Daniel is going to talk about revenue models.
Yeah, cool. I'd say one thing just on top of that I definitely encourage at any point, please do jump in, just in terms of our breakout group. There were a few questions that were like probably quite specific that really up for answering as we go, because I think the top level coverage is inevitably, when we're trying to cover things off for a range of organizations, going to be quite general. So please do at any point jump in with your specific questions as and when they come up, and we'll try and answer them for you. Cool. Robert, do you have the slides to hand in terms of just resharing? Mine aren't up on the screen at the minute. I can get them if they're not. I also think you're on mute just at the minute, but cool, we're good. Brill. So for this section, it's really just thinking about where's the money actually going to come from to sustain your organization. So I suppose to start with, just looking across these, are there any for any of you that immediately jump out that yes, this is our very distinct revenue stream and we're really comfortable with that anyone's happy to just jump in with and flag?
Yeah, so some of ours come through fundraising and from businesses as well. We do have a small amount that comes in through schools, but yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. And yeah, by all means, please use the annotation tool as well to kind of jot some bits down here. So a bit of a range there at 2 to 3 degrees. Anyone who's reliant just on a single revenue stream at the moment?
So at the moment, mine's been grants. I've been relying on grants at the moment.
Okay, cool. And where do those chiefly come from, those corporate ones?
So kind of a mixture. So one was from the university. The other one was actually from a charity, but their role was again kind of specializing and supporting social entrepreneurs to be able to scale. So kind of a mix. Yeah.
Cool. So in a second, well, Rob's gone through to that, so we'll touch on these different kind of areas. So I suppose if we're working with schools and you're directly delivering something to schools, quite often they're going to be the most direct sort of obvious way of having a revenue stream there. That's chiefly what we do at Unifrog as well. So it's a subscription-based model where schools pay an annual fee to subscribe to Unifrog. That works well in that there's obviously one of the key pros here in terms of freedom to do what we want. We can set that pricing and adjust it as long as schools can afford it. But of course, as I think lots of us know, school spending power is really quite limited. So that's one of the downsides of this. And then on top of that, we've started to explore other different channels. So you touched there briefly on funding from other institutions like universities. So I think there's a lot of opportunities out there to explore, whether that's, so for us, we work particularly in the careers and higher education access space. So there's what used to be called, or ticket size, I'll come back to them just a sec. But there's what used to be called NCOP, which is now UniConnect. So that's a big scheme pulled together where there's lots of funding going into higher education projects that can be tapped into there, and looking out for those kind of different schemes that are pulled together depending on the kind of niche that you operate in, I think is really important. In terms of ticket size, that's very much sort of the amount of revenue you're going to be able to bring in from a particular sale. So schools, typically you're not going to be able to bring in huge sums of money for any individual sale or piece of funding, whereas for the most part, as you go across from left to right here, these will typically get bigger and bigger. The downside quite often as you do go from left to right with these is often they come with more strings attached. So you might have to fulfill quite a few different criteria to be able to tap into some of these larger elements of funding. And sometimes some of that money might be withheld as well until you've hit certain objectives. So for a lot of, particularly I think I often see with corporate partnerships and grants on that side, they might release a certain chunk of money to start with, but then you need to hit a bunch of certain objectives along the way. And so it's important to really assess how confident you are that you're going to hit them. So when it comes into budgeting and saying, okay, well, they're going to give us another £20,000 at this date if we've done X, Y, and Z, how confident are we of doing that? Are we of doing that before we're going to be able to tap into that money? So make sure you really look at those different elements really closely when looking at those different types of grants and corporate partnerships. I guess the main thing really that I was at 2 to 3 degrees, sorry, I missed you, was that made that comment. It seemed like you already had a good combination of different ways that your revenue comes in. And that's probably one of the most important things to do if you've got the capacity for it, is to identify a couple of these different channels that are going to be most appropriate for you and really scope those out. Because with almost any of these, if you're relying just on one of them, even if it's spread out across a lot of different schools, what if something happens, i.e. the start of the pandemic, for instance, that's going to affect all those schools across the board, or a sudden change in policy that might affect you. So I think an over-reliance on any one stream can be a little bit more dangerous. So whether that's just a particular piece of funding that for some reason isn't there next year or gets given to someone else, or like I said, a sort of a bigger issue that affects things across the board when it comes to schools or different kinds of businesses. If you can spread your bets a little more and have a couple of different ways that you're bringing in money, so maybe that's selling something directly to schools whilst also getting some additional money through fundraising, or exploring different businesses and how they can support you from perhaps sort of CSR element or any other schemes they have. As long as you've got the capacity to do that, I think that's really worthwhile. Robert, is there anything you wanted to add on this particular slide? Might still be on mute. Or you've got nothing else to add.
Sorry, I was shaking my head saying no, nothing else.
Cool, couldn't see you on my gallery view. Wicked. In that case, I suppose related to this, and I know like in our group, for instance, Jemima, you had a particular question, which this might be a good time to answer that, which was about selling to schools. But after that as well, I think that's a great time, any of those different areas, and it might even be useful, I don't know, Robert, to even jump back to that slide, but if we keep it on questions, that might be a useful reference point for any questions that anyone has. And yeah, Jemima, I don't know if it's useful for me to answer that one to start with, if you have to repeat it.
Yeah, definitely. So with our programme, we're hoping to sort of launch in September and sell to schools directly, but we want to do a pilot year. Something that we're a bit concerned about is, because we're piloting for a year, is at what point do we start kind of selling to schools directly, and at which point do we kind of go for the grant funding first whilst we pilot? Do you have any advice on that at all, kind of at which point you start kind of generating most of your revenue by selling directly to schools?
Yeah, I guess there's one answer, which is it depends. But more based on my own experience, I'd say selling to schools much sooner rather than later. As soon as you're pretty happy that it's a good offering, I think is really important, I suppose, for two reasons. One of which I'd say just based on our experience in terms of engagement and usage, I typically find that when there's money involved, so when schools are literally financially bought in, they're quite often then also more emotionally bought in. And if it's a pilot program that's been dropped in, or it's a nice to have, I think there's, as a result, often less internal accountability for really engaging with that. And as we know, most teachers and people who are going to be driving these programs are often wearing multiple different hats. They're really busy. And if it is just a nice to have there, then I don't think you often get those same levels of engagement. If you don't see the levels of engagement with whatever your service or project or program is, they're less likely to actually buy into it down the line, because they'll just say, well, it was good, but we didn't really use it. So that's kind of on one side. I also think if you're trying to sell it sooner rather than later as well, you're going to get a much better sense sooner on of, yeah, what are the different price points you can sell it at. And then when it comes to longer term financial sustainability, quite quickly you're starting to get answers around, okay, well, how much additional grant funding do we perhaps need to top this up? When can we afford to hire another person down the line? So yeah, I think basically as soon as you can, essentially, would be my
I would echo that. I think there's something from the tech world in the mentality of just ship your product, get it out there, and get people buying it, because you could spend years developing something, but one of your biggest assumptions, and I guess the key here is what's the quickest way to test your biggest assumptions? And one of your biggest assumptions is people are going to buy it. So if you're not charging them for it, you're not testing your biggest assumption.
Yeah, for sure.
There are a couple more questions in the chat.
Seema's asked in the chat, any tips on how you convert schools from not paying to paying? That is that is a good question. I guess with with that, it's essential. I think it's really, I feel almost a thing of honesty is the best policy and the best way to really tackle that point, which is it was free because we had a bit of initial funding to pilot this project, for instance. But now we're at the stage where that funding's running out. We've had fantastic feedback though. We think there's real value here. We've got X, Y, and Z down the road or wherever who have bought into it and are seeing all these kinds of returns. So I think them talking about the kind of impact that you're having and using some case studies or statistics to back that up is important as well. But yeah, also being frank about the situation. And sorry, there was another question there about, okay, quick switch, yeah, unless there's anything to expand on that question. But otherwise, are there any other questions anyone has at the minute about different types of revenue streams or any kind of queries along those lines?
Yeah, I have a quick question, just based on both of your experiences. Aside from schools, what has your experience been with working with government over these past years, and can you say anything or speak anything to what you understand as the future landscape to be with regards to this type of funding for our sector?
My personal experience is we have, as much as possible, avoided going down that road because we feel it is often quite time consuming, potentially hamstrings us in terms of what we want to do. We've always wanted to be quite agile and dynamic, and we're quite fortunate, I think, that schools see real value in what we do at Unifrog, and we're able to bring in quite a lot of revenue directly in terms of our subscription costs. And there have been times when there have been larger government tenders and things like that that have cropped up that we've considered, but quite often that comes with so much, well, okay, you need to be able to, for us, it's often tech implications of integrations we'd need to build in, a whole different elements of reporting that we don't think are necessarily that useful and would be a real drag on our resources. That mean for us, we've tended to avoid going down that road, which means I'm afraid I can't answer more specifically about that. I don't know if, Robert, you're able to expand on that bit at all.
I think, I mean, one of the key things with government contracts is that one, they're quite, unless you happen to be really fortunate and you're in a specific area where government has got a particular fund or you build up a relationship to fund it, they don't tend to want to, they're not going to directly fund something really small. So if you look at something like NCS, is massive, right? And it's funded directly by government, by DCMS, I think. So you tend to, that's when we're talking about big ticket sizes, you're tending to move to these big ticket sizes. But equally, that's where the huge amount of risk is that Daniel was talking about. So, you know, a really tragic story is about Be Inspired. Be Inspired went into liquidation and they went under. And they were, you know, they were a sizable business. I think they were a charity of about 30 people or so. And they had a government contract, and for whatever reasons, that didn't get renewed, and they just weren't able to pivot quickly enough and generate new income, and the whole organization went under. So yeah, a lot of big organizations that get big and do stuff at scale have big government contracts, but that's really hard, A, to achieve in the first place, and B, when you do, you live off those contracts, and it's really hard to remain sustainable and flexible. There are lots of more questions there, and Linda was an ambassador for the Inspire. I'm slightly mindful of time, and thinking maybe we should move on to the next section. But if we've got time at the end, you've still got questions, and definitely we can come back to those. So now we move on to the slightly technical section of unit economics. So this is as bad as it gets, so bear with us on this one. So a quick question. Is anyone able to give me some examples of a variable cost or a fixed cost? Start with variables. Can anyone come up with any variable costs that they might be able to give examples of? I wonder if I leave an awkward silence for long enough that anyone will volunteer.
Can I just say, with variable, is that to do with things that inflate? Is that what you mean by a variable cost?
Yeah, it's things that change. Yeah, costs that vary, costs that change.
So that could be bills. I don't know. I know it's quite broadly speaking. Anything that's kind of attached with a VAT as well. That was what I was thinking.
Yeah. So I mean, that probably shouldn't be an issue for anyone here, but it may at some point be. So these are variable costs, the costs that change depending on how much you sell, right? So let's look at a couple of examples. So if you sell more and maybe you're an organization that has to travel to deliver something in person, then those costs are going to, your travel costs, if you're sitting at home, are going to be zero, like ours have been recently. But if you're out in schools, whether you're in the community and you've got to travel, then the more you deliver, the more you sell, the more you've got to travel and the higher your costs. Same with freelancers, or maybe you're an organization that runs something in the community and you need event venues in order to deliver what you're doing. Again, that's going to be a cost that's only incurred if you actually do that activity. And the same with marketing. Whereas fixed costs are those which, doesn't matter how much you do or don't do, they're just going to stay the same. And that's going to be your rent, for example, unless you're in a kind of flexible working space, but even then it's probably going to be quite steady. Salaries, insurance, that type of thing, that's all going to be a fixed cost. So these are just two ideas which are really good to have in your head when, and we're going to be applying these in a minute. Just thinking about, okay, what changes when I sell more, and what do I need to think about when I'm budgeting? So that's something we're going to park that. And just one more concept we're going to think about briefly is direct versus indirect costs. And all this means is that direct costs are those that directly relate to your products. So that might be the salaries for people who maybe they're out delivering your program in schools. That's their actual salaries to do that. That would be a direct cost, right? Because they are directly delivering your product. Maybe you've got an incredible platform like Unifrog, and you've got development costs for that. That could be a direct cost because your product requires people to build it, so people building that product could be a direct cost. And if, say, you had something physical, there aren't tons of people making products in the FBA, but I guess there's people like BorrowMe who actually have physical boxes, and they have raw materials, and again, that's a direct cost. Whereas the opposite of that, an indirect cost might be leadership salaries, might have some HR software, accounting software, stuff that is in the background, doesn't directly contribute. And funders may often ask for a similar breakdown to this as well. So we've got a question here from Emma, which is, when you're talking about growth projections, does a salary of a job that you will only recruit for if you hit a certain sales volume count as a fixed or variable cost? That's a really good question. So that's still going to be a fixed cost, right? Because what you're doing, and the interesting thing about salaries and capacity is that think of it as steps, right? When you recruit, you suddenly get a huge jump. You recruit someone, you get this huge jump in capacity, that entire person's capacity, and then you basically have to fill that. So maybe you recruited that person because you think, okay, I'm going to have enough, and then you've got to fill that entire person's capacity, and then the same thing happens again. So if you think of that as a kind of fixed cost, but yeah, it might be one that you only make the decision once you hit a certain salary, but you are stuck with, I say stuck with, hopefully that you don't feel like that about your new team member. but you are stuck with that cost, and it's not going to change just because you then don't hit your next target, unless you have to restructure. So there's a couple of ideas there, and we're going to think about these now in the context of pricing. So I don't know if, I imagine lots of people have faced this question: how on earth do I go about pricing my products? Well, to give you a bit of a way of thinking about it, framing this question, there are two broad categories of doing this. The first is called bottom up, and the second is called top down. So bottom up, well, bottom up, you start with your costs. So you start with your costs, and this is where understanding your costs and how they break down is really important. So you'll have those, as we talked about, those fixed costs, those overheads, they're not going to change. You've then got your variable costs. Those are the ones that are going to change dependent on how much you sell. Then on top of that, you're going to want a bit of margin. What's margin? Margin is how much you're adding on top here, on top of your costs, as hopefully as a surplus in your account, so or a profit, as you might call it, and maybe often people target a percentage as well. And then you add all of those up, and then you get your price on top. So you know by doing it that way that you're going to cover all of your costs, and you're going to get a bit of margin as well. So that's a great way to start. Another way to do it is you think about top down, and this is slightly harder, but particularly in terms of information. So one of the, I guess, theories around this is you go to the market and you say, how much do I think a school, for example, how much is a business going to pay for this thing, whether it's a platform, whether it's a program you're delivering, how much are they going to pay for this? Because I can see other people are doing this person's selling it for this much, this person's selling something similar for that much. How much can I get away with, basically? And so you can take that approach and say, well, I think I could get away with, say, £1,000 for my program each year. And then you've got to say, okay, well, if I'm starting with £1,000, I then got to deduct a margin of, say, 10%. And then that's going to get me to my costs. So you basically flip it the other way. You start with the price and say, okay, well, if I'm going to sell it for £1,000 and I need a margin of 10%, so I'm going to have that £100 margin, what do my costs have to be? And then you have to engineer your costs to make sure that it's affordable within the price of what you're selling. And in reality, you can obviously you could do that both ways. So yeah, that's a little bit of an introduction to pricing. Now, we've thought about different types of costs. We've thought about pricing. Now, when it comes to thinking about, okay, so I know what my different costs are. I've worked out how much I think I should sell my product for. Now I need to sense check that, and I need to start thinking about a budget. So you're sense checking this, and one of the best things I think you can do to sense check a lot of your assumptions, and someone earlier mentioned growth assumptions, is thinking about break-even analysis, which is this question: how many units, or how many pieces, or how many programs do I need to sell at this price to cover my costs? That's the key question here, because then you can say, well, because all very well, you might say, right, we're going to sell 1,000 programs this year. It's going to be great. We're going to get on board 1,000 schools. And if we do this, then X, Y, Z. But actually, what you want to know is, well, what's the bare minimum I need to do in order to break even, so that we're not going under? And then let's see if this is sensible. So let's do a little worked example here. So say that you're maybe this is a subscription business, a bit like Unifrog, and say that your price per subscription is £200 a year. So you charge a school £200 a year. And you've got some costs associated with that, which are variable. So that means that they're £5 per subscription. Then you've got some fixed annual costs. So as we said, maybe that's rent, maybe you've got some salaries there as well. So can anyone here have a go? Take a minute, do use a calculator because the numbers don't divide perfectly. And let's see if is anyone brave enough to have a go at what they think the break-even volume is here. Silence. Okay. In that case, I'll talk us through this one. There's someone, 154. Thank you very much. Very good, Vanessa. That is exactly what it is. So how do we get to 154? So, well, in fact, Vanessa, do you want to talk us through how you got to 154?
So what I was thinking is you just need to remember the variable costs. So you're not really getting £200 per subscription. You're getting 195 because it costs you a £5, and then divide that into your fixed costs to work out where your break even was.
Exactly. That is exactly how you get there. So that's a great way of thinking, okay, well, I've said that we think that we should sell this for £200. But actually, that means we're going to have to sell it to 154 schools. I don't think we've only spoken to 10 schools this year. That's not going to work. So let's run another example. And does anyone else want to have a go at answering this one for us? Very similar. You can put it in the chat if you like. $54. Thank you very much, Emma. So, if you then say, well, actually, look, you know, getting 154 schools on board next year, that was just not going to be possible. But if you're saying, well, if we increased our cost to our price, sorry, to £600 for this subscription, then we actually only need to get 51 schools on board, and I think we can probably get about 60, say. So actually, that's a much more sensible approach. So this is a great litmus test. It's a great sense checker, and it's really simple, right? It's you don't need tons of information. You don't need tons of data or a massive spreadsheet to calculate this. You just need to know what your costs are and your price to get to that. So this may be a little bit overwhelming because this is just lots of lines with numbers. But let's just work through this as an example. So this is thinking about that cost-driven pricing. So let's just work through a real-life example or potentially real-life example and think about how this might look. So you start out, as we said, similar to the last one, you've got a gross salary of £30,000. You've got someone, maybe you're starting out, you've got one person, it's your salary, and it's £30,000. So you're doing this in Excel, you put that in. Always remember the real cost is not the salary, it's what they call the fully loaded salary. It sounds like something, I don't know, like get fully loaded nachos or something, but makes it sound more fun. So that's with NI and pension. So I usually add on, depending on what it is, but I usually add on about 19–20% to salary to get the real true cost to the organisation. Then you've got some overheads. So say you've got £10,000 of overheads, and you've also got 10 delivery staff. So you've got 10 delivery staff, and so if you're thinking about remembering that direct and indirect cost, this is where that type of thing comes in. So you've got your overheads, and you want to apportion the cost of your overheads to each of your delivery staff. So you say you've got those 10 delivery staff, you say, well, if we split all of our overheads, our £10,000 overheads, across those 10 staff, that's £1,000 per overhead. So now what we've got is we've got a fully loaded salary for one of your delivery team who's out delivering stuff in schools, and you've got an apportioned overhead as well. So in total, you've got your £37,000 there. Then you're saying, well, how do I work out? So we know now what the cost is, right? This is the cost associated that's got to be covered. Somehow we've got to cover both our overheads and the salary of the person delivering this program in schools. So how do we go about that? How do we think about that cost element and the pricing? Well, what we can do is we can say, well, how many days do they work? What's the daily rate? Right? What does this cost us per day? So you could start with the cost for each work day in the year. So there are 260 working days in each year. And you can take that £37,000, you can divide it by 260, and then that will give you a cost per working day of £142. So you could say, well, actually, okay, it costs us £142 a day to deliver, so we're going to charge at least £142 to a school to deliver this. But hold on a second. The reality is probably you're not going to be able to deliver for 260 days a year unless you've got some sort of superhuman capabilities or you're drinking a lot of Red Bull. So what the reality may be, once you've done all your admin and you've done X, Y, Z, and you've had some team days and done some nice stuff, you may only be able to deliver 100 days a year. So those delivery team out in your schools may only be able to do 100 days a year. So actually, instead of dividing by 260, you've got to divide that £37,000 cost by 100, which obviously gives you a nice round number, 370. So you can then say, well, I know that my variable costs, which here are kind of non-existent, but my fixed cost, my salary, plus the overheads, come to 370. And I know that I want, as we mentioned before, give yourself a bit of leeway, give yourself as much margin as possible, be kind to yourself. So if you can put a 50% margin on top of your costs, I would say do it. That would be a little tip. You will make your life much, much easier if you give yourself a lot of leeway on what you're charging out. Particularly if you're doing day rates and you're charging out day rates, or you're calculating your program based on that. So you can then say, well, let's add a 10% margin onto that, and that gives you a £407 day rate. And then what you can do is you can say, well, now I've got my day rate, and I think this program per school is going to take 10 days to deliver per school. So you just multiply your 407 by 10 to give you your roughly £4,000 cost for a program. So what you've gone from there is we've started, as we're all the way back there with our pricing example here. We started with our costs, we added our a bit of margin on, and we got to a final cost. And what we did that for was on a daily basis. So then you can then say, well, this program takes this many days to deliver, and therefore you multiply the number of days it's going to take to deliver your program by your daily rate. And you know that you're going to be covering all of your costs there and giving yourself some margin. So I take a little breath there, because that is quite a lot, and I know there's a lot of numbers there. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Anything that they wanted to jump in with? Anything that was unclear? No one would say, "Oi, what was that all about?"
If you're presenting this, Rob, to a funder, for example, how do you represent the question of the margin? Because funders are conditioned to look at the pricing of the salary and any additional costs. They understand the concept of an overhead, in my experience, but an overhead plus a margin, you're not necessarily going to get that past people.
So so there are different ways of doing it. So, and each funder will have a different template, annoyingly, don't they? Every funder's got a different template, and you have to split it out in a completely different way for every funder, which is always fun. But I think there are different ways of, I'm not going to say hiding it, but there are different ways of building in your margin into different parts of your costs. So, for example, if they ask for a day rate, so some don't ask for salaries, you can build in your margin just into your day rate or to your salaries. You can build it into your overheads. That would be my advice. I guess it just depends on form by form for each funder, usually. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? Hi, Jemima.
Hi, really similar to what Emma said. How do you justify that margin to schools? Is it sort of a different or similar approach?
I mean, schools, it depends on your program, but schools are not generally going to ask for a breakdown of any of your costs ever. They don't care, they're not interested. So I really wouldn't worry. We have we at one point, Skillsbuilder would sell delivery be above and beyond our program at a particular day rate. And we just say, this is our day rate. This is what, but you know, we wouldn't even usually call it a day rate. We would say, well, this is what this specific bit of training costs. And that's never been an issue. Cool.
Yeah, definitely there. It's
Done
just
then.
a matter of saying this is the price, and this is why it's great. The one thing I'd maybe add as well to what Rob was saying, it's a similar point, but maybe for Emma, it's looking for those variable costs as well that Rob was talking about. They're the easier places you can be able to build in that margin, because just by nature, perhaps if there's freelancers you need to get to come in to help with a bit of, I don't know, filming for a particular project or whatever it might be. If you always err on the upper end of what that variable cost might be, then I think that's the best way of building that in.
That's really good advice. So we've covered quite a lot, and there's now just one or two more concepts to introduce you to. And the first one is marginal costing. And this is the incremental cost of selling one more unit. And I've used unit here so that it applies to everyone. That unit might be one more subscription at Unifrog, it might be one more school program at Skillsbuilder. It might be one more, whatever it is, one more widget that you're selling. So let's start with a little question here. There's 1 month of financial year left, and one of the team has spare capacity. A funder has offered to pay for 10 days consultancy at £300 per day, but our usual day rate is £500. Does anyone want to answer, should we accept this? You can put it in the chat, put a quick yes, no in the chat. So Vanessa's saying yes, Emma's saying yes. We've got a lot of yeses, and I think this is hopefully therefore quite intuitive, right? Exactly that question. What else are they going to be doing for those 10 days? Well, although this is really intuitive, there's also like the formal name for this, which is just marginal costing. So there's no marginal cost for us to deliver this work. We've already paid those fixed costs. Remember, going back to fixed costs, we've got that salary, it's already paid. We've got capacity, that person's not doing anything. So our day rate is £500. And that's what we've calculated in order to ensure that we're sustainable. So you do need to keep an eye on that. You need to make sure that you're not constantly doing this type of thing, because otherwise it's never going to add up. But equally, you've got to make a decision right now. Do we sell these days for 300 instead of our day rate of 500? And of course you should, because you've got no other nothing else to do. And this is this idea of an opportunity cost. Could we be doing something more valuable with our time? Maybe you could. Maybe actually there's a new product you think you could be investing that time in instead. But just bear in mind that these ideas of a marginal cost, a relevant cost, and the opportunity cost, whenever it comes to making decisions mid-year or whenever it is about how you're going to use that time, or how you're going to, whether you're going to accept a lower cost on anything. So, oh, I got ahead of myself there. I have helpfully hidden, everything is hidden by my Zoom controls, which is very annoying. So I can't see what the title of the slide is. So I'm going to read out to myself the subtitle, which is, if you're selling products, your marketing and sales spend must be less than the lifetime value of customers and still allow room for all your other costs and margin. Yes, exactly. This is all about literally one of my favorite topics, which is just tragic, just cost per acquisition. And I talk about cost per acquisition all the time, and I love talking about cost per acquisition. So another one for the chat. If it costs us £200 on marketing and sales to generate £100 of revenue, is that sustainable? Seeing some shaking heads there. We've got some no's coming in. So, of course it's not, right? So if it's going to cost you £200 to sell something, but you only earn £100 from it, you've lost out by 100 quid. So let's work this through. What does this mean in practice? Let's look at a little bit of a worked example. And I should just clarify some of the language here. Cost per acquisition sometimes is a bit of a jargon. That is the cost of acquiring one customer. So that cost could be through social media. So maybe you're advertising, you're doing an ad campaign on Twitter. How much do you have to spend on Twitter in order to get one person to convert and buy your program? So maybe if you spend £100 and you convert 10 people, you sell 10 products through that campaign, a marketing campaign, and it's cost you £10. So let's work through a more detailed example of that. So you've got your marketing campaign, maybe it's on social media, whatever it is, maybe it's in print, maybe you're doing some mail outs to schools, and that's costing you £1,000. But there's also this sort of non-cash cost here, which is the team hours spent marketing and selling. So you've got 24 hours there, and you've worked out the cost of that per hour based on salaries is about 20. So the team cost for your marketing campaign is 480 quid. So you've got this total campaign cost, your whole campaign cost for doing this marketing, including some spend externally and your own team time, is 1,480. So you do this great campaign, or maybe not such a great campaign, let's see, and you manage to generate 11 sales from it. Great, that's really interesting. So what we know is that it cost us 1,480 to get those sales, and we generated 11. So a bit like with our example earlier, we just divide 1,480 by 11. And so in a simplified way here, what we've got is a cost per acquisition. We know that it costs us £135 to acquire each of these 11 customers. And then what we can do is we can say, well, the average sale value was £150. So initially you might say, well, hold on a second. It costs us £135 just to get these customers, and then we're only selling them £150 worth of stuff. So really, is that enough? Is that 150 less 135 going to be enough to cover our costs, all of our variable costs, our fixed costs? Maybe not. So maybe on that basis, you say, actually, hey, look, let's not use this marketing spend, or we need to find a different way of acquiring customers, or we need to increase the price of our product, going back to the pricing question. But there's just one more thing to bear in mind here, and that's the number of repeat purchases. And the challenge you're likely to have, a lot of the group here today, is that you're just not going to have the data on that. You're not going to know on average how many times a customer comes back to you. So whereas some of the bigger organizations, maybe at Unifrog, I'm pretty sure they have a good idea of how often, how many years on average a school subscribes to Unifrog for. And so you can then, if you do have that information, or you're willing to take a bet, you can say, actually, I think I can work out the average lifetime customer value. So not just the value of the sale, but the lifetime customer value. And so say it's 2.5 years or 2.5 on average purchases, you can say, well, that's £375 that I'm actually generating from acquiring this customer once. And you only have to acquire them once, right? I mean, and there's obviously complications there about, are you then spending on re-enrollment or whatever it is, and marketing to your current customers. But suddenly that 135 in the context of 375, well, you may then have enough margin to justify spending 135 on acquiring that customer. So we've got some questions there. What software do we use? Yeah, we use Salesforce as well, and we can talk about that a little bit at the end. Are there any other questions on this bit?
I have a quick question. Just in the cost per hour that you calculated per staff member, assuming that you didn't include marginal cost there to get to £20, did you? Sorry, when I say marginal cost, I mean to say you didn't add a margin onto the staff cost. That's true staff cost, isn't it?
Yeah, because what you're trying to do here is you're just trying to work out what it actually costs you to generate those sales. So you're not pricing this as it's not a product that you're selling. So you'd only be adding that margin on if you're looking at pricing it to sell it. Whereas this is about actually working out the actual cost to you.
Okay, got you. Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess just a quick follow-up question on that. Sometimes we do have marketing costs that are incorporated into a program. So just taken from what you said last time, that it would be useful to include margin in the program cost that you're selling to a client as well, but also factoring in possible repeat acquisition.
Yeah, I think so. Daniel, was there anything you wanted to add on cost per acquisition? Do you have any insights or tips?
Yeah, I guess one thing you made the point that we've got more years of evidence now and quite a large evidence base as well to look at for this. But when we look at our cost per acquisition, so for us to acquire a new partner school, that's a fairly big outlay for us. So the actual fee the school pays just about covers that. So when you then consider all our other overheads, rent, our account management team who aren't directly involved in selling, HR and operations team, so on and so forth, if it was just based on acquiring new schools, we'd be in a bit of a sticky situation. Fortunately for us, when it comes to schools resubscribing, so because it's a subscription model, at the end of every year, we say, hey, do you want to resubscribe? We have a pretty high resubscription rate. And by modeling out off the back of that, we're able to know that because our cost for, not for acquisition, but for keeping a partner school on board is really low, that's then in the longer run how we can ensure our financial sustainability. That means we need to have a real laser focus on making sure that schools do engage really well, see real value in the work that we do to maintain that resubscription rate. And we track that rate really closely because of how closely it ties into our finances, essentially.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess a good insight also into the impact of the type of thing that you're selling has on this. If you've got a tech product where the marginal cost of selling, of actually delivering the tech product is zero, one more license doesn't cost you anything, then suddenly customer acquisition at the outset, as long as you can get keep those customers, you look at a huge amount, you can really stomach potentially a big initial loss on that, because you know that actually in future you can then generate your surplus elsewhere. If you're delivering a program that's delivered by actual people, say for example, then you're not going to be able to stomach such a big loss, because you're always going to have those variable costs associated with say selling one more program. So that was the questions. But did we have, just wrapping up this bit of section? Appreciate this was the nasty one. Did we have any final questions on this bit?
There was one other question in the chat about, is it useful for early stage innovators to upskill to be able to do their finances themselves, or sometimes useful to get external support like an accountant? For us over the years, we've had external support, and actually the accountants that we work with, I think, they support a few different other, or work with a few different other organisations who are part of the Fair Education Alliance. And if anyone wants an introduction, I'm sure Multiply, which is the organisation, would be very happy to have a chat. The guy who runs it as well, he's also very helpful. So in terms of even just having a bit of a Q&A, I say this now, he'll probably, if he ends up getting 8 different inquiries from people who will just want to have a bit of a chat and not pay anything, maybe he'll get grumpy with me, but that's on me. But I'm happy to facilitate any introductions to Chris there, who's really helpful to probably just help give you a sense of maybe what you need at this time, because that's very much his area of expertise. So I'm very happy to help with any introductions there if that's useful. I don't know if there's anything more on the sort of pro bono front, or anyone you can recommend, Robert.
What I would say for ongoing finance is that you might get a bit of, for your initial bit of planning, you might be able to get a bit of pro bono, low bonos type of support. But the reality is that this is ongoing. This isn't going to go away, and you're not going to be able to get ongoing pro bono accounting, for example. And it's not even just about the accounting, it's about the strategic decisions that you're making as well. So I'm massively biased, hugely biased, but I would obviously say upskill. And I would say do some online accounting courses and work out how it works, because if you do that, your life will be infinitely easier, and it is worth investing the time, because otherwise you end up 3 years down the line and it turns out that all of your stuff didn't add up, and that you made a massive miscalculation somewhere, and it's all in all these complex spreadsheets that stop working. Yeah. So, budgets and forecasting, over to you, Daniel.
Cool. All right, so this, I think, really leads on from quite a bit of what was just being covered, or this is how I see it anyway, in that budgets and forecasting are really building out from looking at all these different costs you've got and the different income that you've got, and then it's really mapping that out, typically with a budget over the course of a whole year. And then there's a couple of different ways of looking at this, and I mentioned briefly at the start that I've very much, I suppose, been on a bit of a journey myself, upskilling with this and learning as I go. And to start with, certainly on the left-hand side here, when it comes to accrual and P&L, having zero familiarity with this, and when this sort of stuff would come up, just being like, what are you talking about? That does not reflect the cash coming into the bank. And hopefully a bit of an example to give you a distinction here. So I mentioned Unifrog's a subscription-based organization. So let's say we charge a school £120 to sign up to Unifrog for the year. We charge that up front. So at the very start of the subscription, £120 comes in from the school, hits our bank account, and we see that in the balance. So in terms of, from a cash perspective, which is what is probably a little bit more intuitive, and for me is what I'd always been most familiar with, and budgeting for that and accounting for when that comes in, that £120 comes in as a one-off right at the start of the year, because that's what's actually happening in reality, and then we can use that £120 however we like. From a profit and loss or an accrual perspective, we're taking £120, but we are then committing to delivering a service over the course of an entire year. So from an accounting perspective, that then gets dropped into each month of the year. So I said £120. So what that then looks like in our P&L is £10 coming in January, February, March, April, May. So I said about our outgoings potentially, let's say that they exceed, so the cost to deliver that subscription, let's say that's £150. That means that over the course of one full year, we've got £150 going out over the course of the whole year to deliver it. And then we see this £10 coming in dribs and drabs. We're not profitable. However, from a cash perspective, if you know that in the longer run, yes, you're going to spend longer delivering on this program. If you can keep selling more and more upfront, as long as you have a legit strategic long-term plan to perhaps bring those costs down or increase the price you're selling at in the longer run. Because from a cash perspective, you're front loading the cash, you're actually going to, from an existential point of view, keep going even if you're not profitable. Does that example make sense? And please do say if it doesn't, because for me, so you can essentially keep going and exist for a long time whilst not being profitable, because you potentially front load lots of your business. So for us, one of the ways that we have done that in the past and needed to do that to actually just stay alive essentially as an organization, was we'd sell like 3-year subscriptions, and we'd say you get a nice discount on that, but we need the money for that whole 3 years up front. So by doing that, we knew that delivering on those subscriptions in the longer run and all the other kind of costs and overheads we had associated with existing as an organization, if we said to them, yeah, pay us in monthly dribs and drabs, then perhaps within a few months we'd go out of business. But we knew that if we could keep scaling and keep growing, keep adding value to the platform so that we could charge more down the line, by taking this money up front in cash terms, our liquidity is going to be fine, as long as, like I said, you've got a lot longer term plan to deal with the problem you're gonna potentially face down the line. Because from an accruals perspective, we're not profitable, if that's the scenario. So for me, that's how you kind of distinguish the two with a bit of an example there. So hopefully that makes sense.
I think Daniel, there's a really good point there as well, going back to this tech product versus a kind of man hours product, where it's, as you say, for a tech product, the business model of loss making up front, but we're going to be profitable one day once we achieve scale. That's the default business model. But if you've got to deliver stuff, so for example at Skillsbuilder, we will get paid upfront as well for a program, for example, at the start of the year or even before the start of the year. So we've got the cash, great. But obviously we still have what's actually a liability to deliver something. Whereas for a tech product, the liability to deliver it doesn't cost you anything. It just, that platform's there and people use it. We've actually still got to employ people to go out and deliver what it is that school has bought. And so for us saying, well, great, we've got the cash, isn't enough, because we need to know that, well, okay, but how are we going to be doing towards the end of the year when actually we've still got all this stuff to deliver, or into next financial year, we've got all this stuff to deliver, but we've been paid for it. So this is where you kind of need both. And one, to be able to say, are we going to have enough cash to exist, as Dan said, and pay the bills? Because you can't pay the bills if you're profitable, but you've got no cash because no one's paid you yet. You can't pay the bills and you'll go under. But equally, if you have loads of cash, but then you just make a loss forever, you'll eventually get through that cash, and then you'll go under as well. Yeah.
Cool.
How do you actually represent that differentially in management accounts? Do you tend to have a set of management accounts which will both forecast income on accrual and a cash basis, or do you have a separate line at the bottom? I know that's like a really boring question.
Two separate budgets for that is how we do it. So in terms of the cash side of things, that's something we track really, really closely. So we'll even, to be honest, on a weekly basis. So I just had a catch up just earlier today with our finance and operations manager, which is just very quickly looking at. So at the start of the year, when we build out our budget and we say, okay, for this month, we anticipate we're going to bring in this much and our outgoings are going to be that much. Then in that month, we sort of take the key headlines for each. So for income, that's very straightforward. That's our UK schools, our international schools. It's our relationships with universities. For us, that's the revenue side, and then our outgoings. So that falls under salaries, travel and expenses, development costs, we just have a quick check-in once a week to just be like, okay, for this month, we said we were going to bring in this much, spend that much. Are we roughly on track to do that? And usually it's just like, yeah, we're looking good. Nothing really to see here. That's fine. But sometimes there might be a distinct discrepancy, and it's just making sure we know exactly what that is. And maybe that's we decided to do an extra chunk of marketing or whatever else. But that's the one that we follow really closely on a frequent basis. And then we'll also take a sort of a longer chunk of time on a quarterly basis to really dig into that, and all the notes we made about those little discrepancies, just kind of assess those and decide for the next quarter, looking forwards, are there any tweaks we need to make as well? Because what we don't want to do is set a budget at the start of the year, find halfway through the year actually we're operating in a slightly different way for perhaps some very good strategic decisions, but then be sticking to this what's now a bit of an antiquated budget for cash that we created at the start of the year. So on a quarterly basis, we look at any little kind of forecasting tweaks we should make to our budget going forwards, just to make sure that we don't start drifting further and further away from the budget that we'd created at the start of the year, when we know that it's just silly to be comparing to that at that point. And then in terms of P&L, for us anyway, that's something to just kind of check in on. And I mentioned about really like front loading some of our subscription contracts. The P&L helps us to see, well, down the line, is there going to be like a sudden big hole or something that we need to be really scared about? Because I think, like I said on the previous slide, that's the way you're going to see if you're actually profitable or not, which in the long run is kind of the most important thing. But it's not something that we track nearly as closely on a sort of weekly or monthly basis. Cool. In terms of different forms of budgeting, I guess there's a lot of different ways you can build your budgets up. The more, I mean, again, this is drawing on my own experiences, but the longer you've been going for and you've been creating different budgets, the easier it is to, and it's this whole thing of looking back at the budget you created before, how closely did we stick to it? And then, okay, we'll use pretty much the same basis again for next year, but make a few little tweaks here and there. That's really handy. But essentially going sort of from that bottom up approach, which Robin mentioned earlier, which is I guess the fourth one here, is for me, it's quite a detailed activity, but it's what probably makes most sense to start with. And that's really, I spoke about these different almost headings like travel and expenses or marketing and conferences. And it's for each one of those, you need to take those categories and be like, what are all the different things we anticipate money going out on? And if you're quite a small organization, that's hopefully quite easy at the start, because it's a few different salaries, it's your rent, it's spent on, say you use something like Salesforce, which came up, it's whatever you've got going out there. And then as much as possible, knowing what time of year those outgoings are going to occur. Sometimes you might not know, like marketing spend, say you put aside a few £100 for creating different bits of marketing collateral. Well, you can maybe say, these are the times of year when we'll do a particular big sales push or something. So we'll drop a little bit in for March and a little bit in for October, hypothetically. Or you could spread it out over different months, but it's about just going through each of those areas really systematically and trying to get a good sense of what the spend's going to be. And I'd always advocate on this, coming back to having a margin or some contingency when it comes to the cost. Inflate that a little bit, but make a note of what you've inflated. Because again, when it comes back to comparing to your budget at the end of the year, you might get to the end of the year and say, if you didn't make any notes, oh, cool, we like massively underspent. Great, next year we can like crank that back down. It's all good. When actually the bit that you did spend what you thought you were going to spend, but make sure that you know what the little sort of margins that you're going to build in, just in case you're going through the year and you think, actually, we're not looking so hot on our sales figures that we need, so we're going to ramp up marketing. Good thing we built in some contingencies so that we can ramp up that marketing activity at this point, and we're not scrabbling around for that cash. We already factored into our plan for the year, essentially, that was going to be there. And I suppose here, coming on to, yeah, sorry, I guess this sort of like feeds in a little bit to where I was going with all of that, thanks. the more that you can map out all of those different areas. And from the sort of the sales side, I guess that's really tricky until you've got a larger evidence base. For us, what that looks like is we try and book in however many meetings with schools a year that we, again, based on our evidence base, we think we'll book in. We have a good sense of what our conversion rate's going to look like. So we say, okay, if we can book in 100 meetings and we know that 50% of those schools come on board, and the meetings will typically be spread out across this span of time because that's what we've seen historically, and schools are going to pay £100, then from there you can quite quickly work out, okay, here's what we think we're going to have coming in. We know all our outgoings because we've gone through in a really detailed way. And then hopefully what you find is, we've got a bit of money to spare. And for us, that's when it comes sort of back to other ways that we can scale. We're always looking with that bit of extra money. It's like, okay, well, how can we plow that into more development work to make the Unifrog platform even better? Are there some other areas that we want to hire into? Maybe we want to improve just the internal side of things and hire someone on the HR front, but because they're not someone who works on the sales side of things, they're not going to be covering their own costs. So that's when we'd maybe look to say, okay, we can afford to make that higher. Yeah, hopefully that gives that's kind of how we approach a lot of that anyway. I'm sorry, I'm sort of rushing through a lot of this because I'm aware we're quite short for time. But Robert, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add there or any other questions that anyone has on that front. I should also say with the end of this, I'm really happy to, if anyone wants to chat through any stuff afterwards or grab a call down the line, that's cool as well. All good, cool. Can move on then.
Great. Likewise, always very happy to talk about any of this stuff. So very, very briefly, because we've only got 2 minutes left now, we will just mention financial operations. I guess my key message here would be try and get it right as early as possible and really invest the time on getting it right. And if you follow that principle of right first time, then it will save a lot of time because things feed through and errors feed through and mistakes feed through. And if you can set up your systems and you can automate them, then you're A, going to save loads of time doing that, but B, you need to make sure that the data going in at the very top of that funnel is correct, because otherwise you're going to end up with stuff in your accounts, which is wrong. So I guess you start out, think of this, you start out with your program, your product, whatever it is, and you've got your income streams. Lots of organizations use Salesforce as a CRM. You can, I mean, we've learned that you can use Salesforce to do pretty much anything. We've built our objectives and key results. We've built a whole app inside of it. We've automated stuff massively. Everything is automated, lead generation, emails, booking, everything goes through it. It's really a tool that you can use. It's very powerful. That then feeds through into our accounting system. We use Xero. I think Xero is pretty much the standard platform. Nod or shake your head. Yeah, Dan's nodding. I think most people use Xero and most accountants as well, if you're outsourcing anything, quite like Xero. There's also one called QuickBooks, and there's also Sage, which was the old school one, which then didn't really innovate quick enough, so everyone moved to Xero. And you can automate stuff to go into Xero as well, and you can use, and then obviously that finally all goes into your management account, and you get your management accounts monthly, quarterly, and then at the end of the year, that goes into your stat accounts, which you may have an audit if you're big enough, and you've got to file it with Charities Commission as well if you're a charity. And as I said, automate early. There's if this then that. There's also Zapier. And you can make stuff so that you can build it so that it just automates. Something will trigger in one platform, will send an invoice somewhere else. So really spend the time working that stuff out. Google Sheets is also a great intermediary and is incredibly powerful actually, and can pull stuff in. You have live feeds from your CRM. You can then pull stuff out automatically. It's way more powerful than Excel for any sort of process like that. Cool. That was a very quick one, and I'm aware that we now have no time left, but I'm going to see if anyone has any final questions. Anyway. Chat. Amazing. Well, thank you everyone so much. We appreciate this. Is yeah, it's not the most fun session, I imagine, but hopefully it's an important one. And the more you learn about it, maybe the more fun it gets as well, and the less painful
Don't know about that.
becomes. But as Dan said, we're both very happy to answer any questions. I've looked at people's Salesforce setup, Xero setup, all sorts of stuff. So yeah, do reach out and get in touch.
Yeah, for sure. Nice one.
Thanks everyone.
Great,
Over to you.
Thank you both so much, and two very generous offers there at the end from both Robert and Dan in terms of some future support. So I encourage you to look them up on LinkedIn and build those connections. Can I ask people quickly, please, to just come off mute and give Dan and Robert just a big round of applause, please? Thank you so much. I think it was super useful. I think really useful to be able to hear from two people who lead in kind of the different sectors. I think a lot of the information out there is very, very much kind of coming from a different perspective. So really good to have you both share your experiences. Cheyenne has just popped in some information into the chat about the Innovation Awards and how to find more information about that and to book in one-to-ones. So please do click on those links and book in a one-to-one with Cheyenne if you haven't already. And just some information there in the chat as well on the topics, things that they've touched on today. So we're just gonna, you could let us know what you thought of the session. We have an issue with the polls, so don't worry about that. We can make sure that we
C1.
Covering that in our follow-up with you. Hope that, yes, yeah.
See, yeah, I think we figured out the poll, so I'll just launch it if everyone can see it.
Ah, great.
Yeah, we did some magic at the back. Cool, I can see 2 people have already voted.
back end magic, brilliant. So if you could just answer for those that come through now. Couple more
there.
to go.
Yeah.
Great, everyone's in.
Perfect.
Thanks so much, everyone. Hope you see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening. Stop recording. Cool.